Ladies and gentlemen, take your seats, please.
Champagne sort of.
Welcome to the launch of Taxing Times. It's time for multinationals to pay up, authored by Khalil, MP, who I'll introduce in a moment. My name is Victorian Trades. I'm the Executive Director of the John Curtin Research Centre. Can I begin by paying my respects to the Wiradjuri people of the Khalil Nation on whose lands we gather tonight and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. I also think it's worth acknowledging that today is International Workers' Memorial Day. When we reflect on those ordinary working people who didn't make it home from work and lost their lives at work. Friends, when Australians think about real leadership, they do often call our greatest Prime Minister, John Curtin. If you kick out the back, you can see a terrific portrait of the great man himself. And of course, our think tank is named after Curtin. Curtin was a thought leader in and outside of Parliament, and he led a wartime government which was simultaneously focused on winning a war, but planning for a better world after the last guns had fallen silent. As Peter points out in his impressive paper, there's always been national Labor governments who have done the big, critical, nation-building reforms, notably in respect to taxation. And for instance, it was Curtin Labor, especially Ben Chifley, Curtin's Treasurer, but also Minister for Post-War Reconstruction, who laid much of the groundwork for a reinvigorated economy and post-war society during the latter years of World War II. Perhaps the most important development was the Commonwealth effectively taking over the power to levy income tax from the states. And this allowed Labor to extend the welfare state by adding a widow's pension, funeral, unemployment, sickness benefits, and substantially increasing payments for existing entitlements. But today, as Peter argues, our corporate taxation system is not fit for purpose. The problem of multinational tax avoidance can no longer be avoided or kicked down the road for a future government, presumably Labor, to deal with. You can read Peter's full paper at our website, curtinrc.org. I would highly recommend you read his paper. And Peter notes that while international efforts are vitally important, and we look at some of the groundbreaking work by the Biden administration, positive developments there, individual nation states and governments can play a crucial role in creating momentum towards global action. That's one of the key arguments in Peter's fine paper, and in a moment I'll ask Peter to speak to the themes of his work. A bit about Peter, I could probably spend a good hour going through his extraordinarily impressive CV. Peter was elected as the Federal Labor member for Wills in 2016 and re-elected in 2019. He was Deputy Chair of the Joint Parliamentary Standing Committee on Treaties and a member of the Joint Parliamentary Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. Prior to his election to Parliament, Peter was Executive Director of Corporate Affairs Strategy and Communications in SBS and Victorian Multicultural Commissioner. He served as a Foreign Policy and National Security Advisor to Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. He has been a non-resident adjunct professor at the Centre for International Security Studies at Sydney University. And prior to these appointments, Peter was based in New York City providing political risk consultancy to government, to multinational corporations, theme of tonight's speech, paper. I'm not sure we went after them during this period, and Wall Street financial institutions. Peter's also been a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institute in Washington, DC. He served at the Department of Defence in Iraq between 2003 and 2004, and was awarded the Australian Overseas Humanitarian Services Medal in 2004. He's also worked for DFAT, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Almost there, through the impressive CV. He has degrees in law and arts from the University of Melbourne and Masters in International Law from the ANU. And we, the John Curtin Research Centre, are delighted to have him on board as one of our esteemed advisory board members. He's been there from the outset. We are super proud to have published Peter's paper, Taxing Times. Delighted to have him as a guest tonight as we officially launch the paper. Friends, without further ado, please welcome Khalil.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Nick, for that introduction, kind introduction, and thank you to the Curtin Centre. And it's great to have a think tank like the Curtin Centre really promote and have thought leaders and MPs and researchers and academics put their ideas out there for public discussion and engagement. And I really appreciate all of that great work that Nick and his team have done at the Curtin Centre. Also, I want to start by actually acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past and present. And thank Trades Hall for having us here today in this wonderful building and this particular hall, very historic. In fact, Anthony from Trades Hall is not here, but he gave me a wonderful tour of the old council chamber building just up the corridor there. If you get a chance to have a look at that. It started the first meetings in 1884 and was really a significant part of the history of the trade union movement and the Labor Party in this country, and it's contested, but the Victorian Labor Party probably started in that room in 1884. People are shaking their heads, so it is contested. Some people say it was in Ballarat, some people argue it was in Ballarat, Trade School in Ballarat, but we'll leave that for another debate. But it is a wonderfully important and historic building, but it's also doing great work here today for workers, and I was at the International Workers' Day Memorial this morning, which was really an acknowledgement and a memorial around 48 Australians who have been killed at work in their workplaces over the past 12 months. And we, as all the speakers said this morning, we never forget the dead and we keep fighting for the living. I also want to thank all of you for coming here tonight. I'm a bit nervous because there's a couple of you who are experts in tax, and I've been talking to you, and economists and so on. I'm not an expert in tax or the an economist, but I did try to do my best to get on top of this issue because it's such an important public policy issue, and I hope we can have a good discussion about this tonight. So tax, the word is really enough to either have you roll your eyes in anticipation of boredom or to start a political war. It flags which side you're on. Are you for big government or small government, red or blue, left or right? Are you boss or worker, Trades Hall or Touareg? But what if there was a tax debate that didn't spark the usual ideological dumpster fire? Taxes that have the potential to appeal to both sides of politics, to raise billions for Australia. Can you imagine that? A popular tax. As popular on the streets of South Yarra as it might be on the streets of Springvale. And what I'm talking about are the taxes that could make sure multinational corporations earning extraordinary profits in this country pay their fair share of tax, which right now they do not. In fact, far from a fair share, they hardly pay any tax at all, while you are probably paying around 32 cents in the dollar, or 27% on average, as a wage earner. Big companies, pay as little as zero tax, or maybe 2% or 4%. And this is hurting all of us, because no matter where you live, what we do, or who we vote for, if they're not paying, we are. So if you allow me a little poetic license, if we're the villagers down on the ground toiling away, the wage earners, the salary earners, the small business owners, most of us are paying our fair share of tax. We do our minimisation, but we pay mostly our fair share of tax. The multinationals are the dragons flying above us, swooping down to collect their golden loot and bringing it back to their dragon lairs across oceans. They are not of this world. They are so powerful they can toy with our tax laws as they satisfy their voracious appetite for profit. And they get away with it because our government lacks the courage to take them on. And you've probably heard this problem before. It isn't new. But why does it persist? To put it simply, our tax system is outdated. It was designed in the 1920s for a very different world. The modern multinational dragon didn't exist. International trade was largely for physical, tangible goods, and it was largely seafaring. So very unlike the digitalised, globalised economy we live in today. And despite fundamental changes to almost every aspect of our lives, our tax system is stuck in time, an archaic framework that is in desperate need of renewal. It fails to account for multinational corporations that exist across borders and is ill-equipped to resist their armies of international tax lawyers, some of whom might be here tonight, who exist solely to find ways to reduce the amount of tax that these large multinationals pay. It's very hard to shoot down these dragons. They move fast. They're often of no fixed address or have a lair on an unreachable island. They're well resourced. And it's particularly hard if our antiquated international and domestic corporate tax systems only arm you with the flimsiest of bows and arrows. Reform is needed because these companies are only acting within the law. Of course, if they break the law, that's called tax evasion, and it's illegal. But what is much more common practice is legal tax avoidance measures. This is the tax reduction or the minimisation that many people engage in. You and I do this when we do our tax returns. Small businesses do it. But the power of these multinational dragons is such that their avoidance measures are on a scale that goes beyond anything we could imagine, and often they're able to take their tax down to zero or close to that. Take Netflix, for example. You would be hard-pressed to find a household in Australia without at least one Netflix account. Yet Netflix Australia paid less than $500,000 in tax in 2019, despite having an estimated 5 million subscribers, and their revenue, which was estimated to be between 670 million and 1.2 billion. It turns out those millions were flown back to the Netherlands, untaxed, to fudge Netflix Australia's profits. I could try and explain how they do it, but it's quite boring. In fact, the boringness of tax avoidance measures is one of the reasons companies get away with it, and the complexity. The nightly news doesn't really cover it. It's not the hot topic on talkback radio. It's just sort of allowed to happen, and has been for a while. And this is just one example. The Australian Tax Office found that last financial year, 1/3 of large companies, and that is companies with turnovers over 250 million, operating in Australia, paid no tax. Zero tax. These are not niche companies. These are companies you've heard of, that you might be a customer of. IKEA, total income, 1 billion, zero tax. Vodafone, total income, 3 billion, zero tax. Nando's, total income, only 191 million, zero tax. All up, 80 multinationals have paid no tax consecutively in Australia for the last 6 years. Others, and big tech are some of the worst offenders here, pay next to nothing. Facebook, total income, 582 million, paid only 2.6% tax. Google, total income, 1 billion, paid only 4.7% tax. And Atlassian, total income 1.5 billion and some change, paid 0.7% tax. What really gets me is really the raw unfairness of that deal. The small businesses that are the backbone of our nation make up 97% of all businesses in this country. They can't route their sales through Ireland or Singapore. They don't have a subsidiary that they can charge a license fee to ensure that they never turn a profit to avoid any tax liability. They are stuck with their PAYE, their PAYG and their quarterly VAT statements, while the multinational corporations play very effectively the shell game with their profits. So if they're not paying, we are. And if your average punter is paying their 30 cents in the dollar, or 32 cents in the dollar if you're a salary, out of their salaries in tax, surely it's not too much to ask that some of the biggest companies in the world pay their fair share in Australia, a country where they are making a profit. And this again makes me think of how united we can be on this front. And we are united. 90% of Australians agree this is wrong, and that we should act to ensure companies pay their fair share. Australians deserve a government that does everything that it can to make sure that these large multinationals are paying their fair share. But right now, we do not have this government. Clearly, this is an issue I'm passionate about, because every dollar that is lost through this type of legal tax avoidance that these big companies use leaves us worse off as a society. It's money lost to our kids' education, to our healthcare, to protecting our natural environment, to looking after our older Australians in their retirement, to the NDIS, to making childcare affordable. It beggars belief that this coalition government is not doing more to address this problem. But maybe not. Maybe it's because they're scared of being seen as anti-business. Or is it to do favours for their big multinational mates? Or is it because they aspire to one day potentially be on the board of one of these multinationals? Or is it just the word tax? Have they decided that they're just going to hack at the expenditure service side of the budget with total disregard to sensible decisions to increase revenue? Because every chance this government gets, they shirk responsibility and they pass the buck. They put slogans before substance and they squeeze money out of those who can least afford to give it. Our small business owners, our workers on minimum wage struggling to get by, people barely able to afford childcare for their kids. Now, changing all of this requires some courage, but it can be done. It's popular with voters, obviously, but because it is right by every measure of equity and fairness. And yet this government doesn't act, either because they're gutless or unimaginative or lazy or a combination of all three. Now, this of course is not just an Australian problem. It's a global one. Globally, nations lose between 130 and 315 billion to tax avoidance tactics every year. That's a lot of money. We don't actually know the full figures. This is an estimate by the OECD because the avoidance tactics are so sophisticated. But it could be billions more. And countries, though, have begun to take notice. Some countries. Over the past decade, there have been a number of significant international attempts to tackle the problem. The most notable of these is the OECD's Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Project, known as BEPS, and the OECD's Pillar 1 and 2 initiatives. These are unparalleled attempts to do something about it, but they are exceedingly complex. With Pillar 1, now this is mind-bogglingly ambiguous, but I spent months of reading on this, trying to get my head around it, with lots of help from some people in this room who are economists and experts. So I kind of understand it myself right now. But I'm not going to bore you with the details. Basically, it's rewriting the rules on profit allocation, profit shifting and transfer pricing so that companies are taxed where they are making their profits, even if they have limited or no physical presence in that country. Pillar 2 is a bit easier to understand, a bit simpler. It proposes a global minimum tax rate. But of course, it's no less difficult to get agreement on, because getting an international consensus where the world's nations agree on rewriting the tax rules and a global minimum tax rate will be no small feat. And this is even with the Biden administration recently throwing its support behind a global minimum tax rate. And I think this helps build the momentum. But while we are waiting for international agreement, these big dragons are flying across our borders, exploiting our antiquated tax systems, getting richer by the day, while our public services become even more stretched. And the Morrison government continues to sit on its hands. But we can do something. We can, of course, support the OECD process, as well as getting started right now. Any action we take at home will help build the momentum towards a global solution to this problem. We just need to be courageous and think big. There are a number of reform options and ways other jurisdictions and countries have already forced multinationals to pay their fair share of tax. The data tax hasn't been applied yet. It's an idea. But it's an option to make multinationals pay their fair share by valuing and taxing personal data that these companies monetize. Our data is valuable. Some call it the oil of the 21st century. Yet we give it away without thinking twice. And watch while billions of dollars are generated from it. There are ideas around a data tax that could say be 1% of the revenue companies earn from selling our personal data, spread out over an entire industry. A digital services tax, a DST, is also an option. This is a tax on sales revenue from digital advertising on the platforms itself. This has already been implemented in France, in Spain, in Italy and the UK. And this DST levy is really all about catching out the big tech multinationals like Facebook and Google who don't pay up their fair share. In France, their 3% DST was estimated to have raised Australian dollars 779 million in revenue in 2020 alone. Our own Treasury studied the possibility of implementing a DST some 3 years ago, but our Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, delayed any action until the OECD handed down its final report, which we're still waiting on, 3 years later. It's interesting that the Treasurer was willing to be the big, brave man when it came to fronting up to Google and Facebook on the media bargaining code issue, when his friends at News Corp were standing behind him. But with this one, on a DST for example, Rupert might side with the big multinationals. After all, News Corp is a big multinational. And so brave, brave Sir Josh doesn't seem quite so brave anymore. A third option that's been mooted is a cash flow tax, a CFT. This approach is more radical, potentially longer-term solution, but it's not too different from a DST. But instead of just taxing the digital dragons, it seeks to take on the whole flock of multinationals. Under a broadly applied CFT, taxable earnings are the domestic income of a business less its domestic expenditure. Taxing cash flow will boost investment, tax revenues, reduce tax avoidance, eradicate the race to the bottom on the corporate tax rates, and level the playing field between domestic and multinational companies, not to mention be a huge boost for local manufacturing. No longer would companies be able to route sales through foreign tax haven countries. Business done here is taxed here. And modelling demonstrates that if implemented, certain models of a CFT would raise between $24 and $83 billion more in corporate taxation revenue than our current source-based system. Imagine what could be done with that money. We could fund TAFE, universities, childcare, invest in public housing and infrastructure. This is a big reform proposal and it would have an impact on our trading relationships. The CFT would require a concerted international effort, a proactive foreign minister and trade minister with a diplomatic strategy to bring our system into the 21st century for business practices that apply now and to navigate our trading relationships. Whichever options we pursue, Australia must seize this moment, particularly as we face the post-COVID period. We need to take the initiative because for too long there's been an acceptance that multinational tax avoidance is an endemic feature of corporate culture, particularly in our Western democracies, and thus it's too tough to tackle. This is a cop-out, and other countries aren't afraid to act. France, the UK, Spain and Italy all have a DST, as I said. They are recouping money for their citizens right now. Biden supports a global minimum tax. By taking on reform, whether it be a data tax, a DST, a CFT, we're also creating a momentum towards an international consensus on rewriting the tax rules and a global minimum tax rate for all companies. With domestic action, we can actually put pressure on recalcitrant low tax havens and the multinationals towards support for a consistent, broad-based global consensus on corporate tax. We need action on this. The whole world actually needs action on this. We need to play our part. We need to be bold. We need to be brave. It has always been Labor governments that have delivered the era-defining policies that make this country one to be proud of. The ability to get a good quality education, no matter who you are, a roof over your head, support for the unemployed and people with a disability, and Medicare, so that a trip to the hospital doesn't force families into bankruptcy. Look, everyone here tonight, you know this. I don't have to tell you this. It's always been Labor. It's in Labor's DNA. It's in our DNA to think big and look after the little guy. And this issue is no different. Labor leaders have made an impact on the world stage at critical times in the 20th century. We have a strong track record of leading the way on the international stage on many global issues. So reform to tackle multinational corporations, make them pay their fair share of tax, is no different. In 2019, Labor took a suite of policies to that last election aimed at doing just that. Tackling this problem is the right thing to do. So we can afford to send our children to great schools. So we can look after the most vulnerable members of our community. So we can retire in dignity to quality aged care. If we can summon the courage, we can slay the dragons. Thank you very much for attending this evening, and I'd be delighted to take any questions you have. Thank you.
trust or Peter. So there's tax.
Can I just, one rule, I don't know if anyone is familiar with Sydney, the character named Bob Gould, Lake Bob Gould, one with immense corporate knowledge. If we could, in memory of Bob, if we could keep our questions succinct and actually
Bob, a really long question. Did Bob ask a very long question?
It was a meandering topic.
Right, so what you're going to try and cut back on tax havens like Jersey Island and places like that where large corporations funnel their money to then decrease the amount of taxes they pay?
That's a good question, Adam. So, Adam, if you didn't hear me, he's talking about Jersey Island, Cayman Islands, Singapore Island, a lot of these tax havens where, you know, sort of poetically said the dragons take all their loot to these islands across the oceans. Basically what they do, they don't pay any tax on them as they sit on the island. But, so a couple of things have already happened. So Biden, I mentioned Biden, Biden Yellen, Janet Yellen's the treasurer, they've already increased what's called the GILTI, which was the US already had a tax on foreign earnings of US companies, so offshore earnings basically. So not just taxing them in the US in their headquarters, but if they're making money in another country, they would tax them those sales in that foreign country as well. They've raised that to 21%. That's trying to shift or disincentivise companies from offshoring to tax havens. It doesn't quite get them if they're actually headquartered in Jersey Island or Cayman Islands. There are other things that need to be done to prevent that. This is the big challenge, Adam. A lot of these countries have actually attracted a lot of big multinationals to headquarter in their country because they're low taxing. Although, interestingly enough, the awareness around the unfairness of this is even, there's a big debate in Ireland now, as I understand, about whether this should continue, and Ireland has been one of those countries that has been a low taxing haven. So the trend internationally and the public awareness is driving this momentum towards addressing this issue. Do I just pick the, this gentleman put his hand up first and I'll go there. Colin.
Yeah, it's a kind of international cabal where companies say, well, we won't invest with you if you tax too much.
Well, I don't know if it's a cabal, but I do remember Gladys Berejiklian running this argument that, if we were a bit stronger on Google, they might leave they might leave Sydney. So let me just address that. This whole argument that, no, we can't do that because they might leave. Google made, I think, $1 billion in Australia and paid, 4% on whatever that, however millions on that. So if Google's making $1 billion and they're forced to pay a little bit more, instead of paying 50 or 60 million, they're paying 200 or 300 million in tax. Do you really think that you're just going to walk away from the other 600 million? You're going to leave Australia? Like, seriously? I mean, Zuckerberg might do it out of spite, because it might be short change for him, but basically, it is up to us as nation states to look out for our citizens' interests and say enough is enough. We're not going to be picked off that way by the big tech companies. So if you want to walk, let's call your bluff. Walk. You're really going to walk away from 600 million because you have to pay a couple $100 million extra in tax? It's going to chicken internationally, but I'd like to do it. Yes, back.
In less than 2 weeks' time, I think it is, we're going to celebrate the 40th anniversary of what the then Treasurer, little Johnny Howard, pronounced as the end of tax avoidance. This was the enactment of the General Anti-Avoidance Provisions, known as Part 4A, and the International Transfer Pricing Rules, known as Division 13. 40 years later, there's been virtually zero litigation on this.
Yep.
How many of your experts have told you that the tax office has been asleep at the wheel and that the government has let them off the hook in not enforcing the existing laws that we have to deal with this rampant avoidance?
That's a good question. I mean, there's two parts to that. The tax office takes direction from the government of the day. So if in the past 8 years the coalition government hasn't really pressed the issue on this, they are responsible. You might make an argument that the tail wags the dog in some respects with Treasury and Josh Frydenberg, but having said that, it's their responsibility. They are the executive, and Josh Frydenberg has said that he has supported the OECD process, but I haven't heard of Pete. We did some some research, we looked it up, not a peep on this. Yet, they are willing to raise revenue by putting in place a robo-debt scheme to squeeze money out of the most vulnerable Australians to raise a couple of $1 billion. By the way, 40% of those debts were false. Okay? So they're raising billions out of pensioners and people with a disability, the most vulnerable people in our community. That's where they're raising their money, but they're not willing to take on the big tech companies who make off like bandits with, by paying 2% in Australia. That's my beef with this government. It's obscene that they would go after the little guy rather than take on those dragons who are actually not paying their fair share. And by the way, that fair share, when you add it all up, that pays for our schools, our hospitals. So there's a double whammy here. Like you pay your taxes, right? They don't. So you're doing your fair share, but you're also getting whacked because the money that they're not paying will also go to your quality of life, your standard of living.
And the GST.
There you go. Dennis. Dean, sorry, Dean.
This is going to be tough because he's a tax lawyer or tax man.
The 2019 latest election policies for taxation were in the end unpopular.
Yeah.
I put that down to due to misrepresentation in the media and by the government. I seen the screen for TV when Tim Wilson's gotten lied about franking credits and how they work. So my question to you is, what's the appetite in the party group for reformative tax policy going into the 2022 election?
That is a good question. Okay, so the first part of that question is you're absolutely right. Tax, I was nervous even just doing this speech tonight because I'm like, and we thought about it, how do I talk about this issue without either A, boring you or completely fluffing it and just not getting it right because people just switch off. It's such a complicated area. And we ran into, that beach, if you like, and ran into those rocks, if you like, at the last election with our tax policies because they were just very difficult to explain and they were easily manipulated by the government. Josh Frydenberg and the rest of them put up there. They even got us on digital campaigns with the Grim Reaper saying we were going to put a death tax on. It was just a simple picture of the Grim Reaper, Labor's death tax or inheritance tax. It wasn't even our policy. But they ran it and apparently on social media this went crazy, millions and millions of views. So they got us in that way because the complication of our tax policy, that we were putting forward was so difficult to understand, they could easily get us on something that wasn't even true. Because people thought, oh yeah, it must be true. It's so hard. So as far as our ambition into the future, that is you're talking. I'm coming from a perspective of a backbencher. I know that our shadow ministers, Jim Chalmers, Andrew Lee, Stephen Jones, who work in this area, have been looking at all of these policies, particularly post-budget, and around policies that have at their core fairness and tackling inequality, particularly in the post-COVID recovery, and around budget repair that's fair, if you like, to use the slogan, sorry. But literally they are going to be making these announcements post-budget and into just before the next election about what we're going to put to the Australian people. Now, it's our challenge to make that understandable to people, to explain to them that the policies we're putting forward are about fairness for you, right? Now, I think the multinational tax issue, I've tried to explain it tonight as simply as I can. It's a complex area. The solutions are very, very difficult. There's a lot of controversy around some of those options that I've put forward. But if we can actually put forward policies that will address this and show the courage in tackling this reform, we're going some way to addressing those fairness issues for the Australian people. And I don't think we should shirk that. I think we need to be brave. I think Labor governments have always been successful when they have taken on big reform and they've done it really well and they've done it for the benefit of Australians, for a better life. This is one of those areas I think we need to do it as well. And
so I think the zeitgeist of tax sort of shifts a bit because we've seen Joe Biden say on the tax higher, we've seen in the UK, they've also reversed their position on income tax for corporations, actually increased it. So if the zeitgeist has shifted, given what's happened in the last 12, 24 months, what is the opportunity to output or wrongfoot Tories by saying, where is our corporate taxation rate at? why are we setting a lower rate? Has that been consideration that Jim, yourself, others in the economic policies for corporates have thought about the way that works that issue?
That's a really good question. It's not a Dorothy Dixon, by the way, but Eamon is an economist, and he wrote a really good paper on the CFC, cash flow tax, if you really want to get into this issue when he was at the London School of Economics. And I met with him a while back now to ask a few questions about this, and he's very helpful in getting me to understand some of the issues around this from a tax perspective. But your point, I think, Eamon, is the zeitgeist, where this is flowing, where the momentum is going politically. Absolutely right. This is why that's why I say we need to seize the moment. We need to demonstrate that the Labor government will actually make a difference to people's lives and address what is this rising inequality, global inequality, but also the squeeze on the middle class, working middle class in this country, right? And they're getting it from both ends. We are having to deal with this. It's absolutely critical. You mentioned Biden, you mentioned some of the other countries that are, Macron took on the big tech with some French flair and bravery, one could argue, and Trump smashed him back down and threatened a trade war, but he stood firm, and the tax is now operating effectively after a pause for COVID-19. In fact, so it's not just the Anglosphere, there are other countries that are doing. India had a DST in place as well. Just on that point though, the DST, the OECD has accepted that some countries may take this unilateral action ahead of an international consensus on a global minimum tax rate, for example. And they've accepted that some countries might want to put a digital services tax in place. So India, France, the UK, Spain, Italy, Austria, I think, these countries put one in place. And they've started to raise revenues. And that revenue is about putting back in the coffers for their citizens, for their public services. And it was hard to do because Macron, when he did it, Trump basically threatened to put a tariff on French wine and all the rest of it. And so we're not in a Trump administration anymore, thankfully. We've got a Biden administration. So the momentum is flowing that way. Now, here's the thing. If Frydenberg decides, which I doubt he's going to do, but he says, oh, you know what? I am going to do a DST now that'll raise 400, 500 million in Australia a year, whatever it might be off the big tech. He's going to do that until there's an international agreement. What's he worried about? Is he scared that Biden's going to go after him? Unlikely, given Yellen and Biden have actually talked about the need for something like this. Maybe not a DST, but certainly a more global agreement. Is he scared of the big tech? Probably. So I don't think they've got the courage to do it. I don't think they have the appetite for it. With respect to our group, I know I've spoken to Jim about these issues, obviously, with this speech and this paper. I've spoken to our economic team. I'm not the economic part of the economic team. My expertise is in foreign affairs. I'd like us to have the bravery to do this, and then maybe I'll have the job to actually get it done, get an international agreement in place. But we need to go there because it is important for our budget repair post-COVID. So it's not money we're raising off the most vulnerable. We're actually paying for our schools and our hospitals and our infrastructure to make sure that Australians have their lives. No more?
Peter, can I throw in a quick anecdote?
Yes, I don't know.
My good friend and comrade, Mr. David Craig, is up there. He used to work for a rotund Victorian senator called Robert Ray, who famously at a national conference, I think it was sometime back in the late 1980s, held up the ALP national platform and said, this is 200 pages long, 196 pages devoted on ways to spend money and 4 pages devoted on ways to raise it. It's sort of just a perspective.
Can I just add to the younger people in the audience here, like your generation, well, I'm a young person sort of, but not anymore really, but the younger people here, there was all this debate about the boomers getting all the public services and free education, free healthcare and all the rest of it, and the younger people having to pay for this into the future. Well, we've got a similar challenge with the post-COVID economic recovery. Who's going to pay for it? Right? And I just think the coalition government, the venality of the path they take, is completely antithetical to what we should be doing in government. It should be about fairness, it should be about addressing inequality, it should be about making sure that young people have all the opportunities and the public services and the goods that their parents and grandparents had in this country. And so that we, as a nation, retain that egalitarian, that sense, that fairness that really characterises or should characterise Australia. Certainly hasn't under the coalition government.
Maybe last question.
Trevor.
Peter, just on the question of the Biden-Yellen combination, I think that's quite an inspired selection having Yellen, because she carries a lot of credibility and people are listening to her. Do you have any feeling as to what platform they're going to pursue to advance this whole notion of a common base corporate tax?
I read the 17-page paper that the US Treasury put out, or that Janet Yellen put out. It's short on detail.
Yeah.
It sets the frame of an aspiration and a push towards a global minimum tax rate. So as far as how they're going to go about this, the first thing they've done is increase, as I mentioned earlier, the GILTI, which is the tax on foreign earnings of US companies, up to 21%. And they're going to undertake a diplomatic effort, frankly, to get other countries towards a GMT, or a global minimum tax rate. Now, Australia has a choice. I mean, do we participate in this process? Do we engage proactively in this and push it, and be part of the push and the momentum towards an international consensus? My argument in the paper that's been published and partly tonight, is that we need to actually be really proactive. Start putting things in place like a DST to push this narrative that you need to address this internationally. Otherwise, it's never going to happen. I see it as a kind of a leveraging position as well, and I see what France has done and the other countries have done to push towards a GMT by really taxing those big tech companies that are getting away with it. So trying to get them towards a GMT is part of that. So I think Yellen will try and bring alongside allies to do this. How much effort they're going to put into it will be interesting, I don't know. But isn't it interesting that on this issue, on climate change, on a whole range of really important international issues, Morrison is kind of trying to catch up. Now suddenly Trump's not in the White House anymore, mate. It's Biden. There's a whole different perspective around these issues, and you are getting caught behind the eight ball. I mean, so that I can't. Maybe I'm wrong, but I can't see Frydenberg and Morrison really jumping on board with Biden and Yellen on this.
The reality is that unless they take a combined action, the targets will adopt a divide and conquer approach to the jurisdictions that they operate in.
And that is the fear. So a lot of these big companies will play for time. Quite happy to play for time. That's why I'm saying there are other options first that you can put in place to make sure that the cost of playing for time is too high for them, and it gets them at the table towards a broader international consensus. Maybe even a CFT needs to be put out there for that reason. No more questions?
Peter,
Thank you.
thank you again. We think your paper was made of the right stuff, so so on that.
Did my head in doing it.
As a small token of appreciation, here's a copy of the right stuff, which may or may not be coded by myself. And wishes are mixed. Yes.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Victorian Trades Hall for allowing us the use of this splendid venue, renovated venue this evening. In particular, I think Anthony Moore. All of them did free tours. Good. You might be lucky enough to catch him in a generous mood yourself if you can make him to Trades Hall. Just a few plugs for the Curtin Centre before we go. You can read Peter's paper, you can read all our discussion papers, policy reports, our flagship magazine, The Toxin. It's the last Toxin, which was a special International Women's Day edition. No blokes allowed, except for a small editorial intervention from yours truly. You can keep up to date with us at and a website, curtinrc.org, on Facebook, curtinrc, and on Twitter and Instagram. We haven't yet joined the cool kids on TikTok. That might be part of the plans for the rest of the year.
Yes.
But we have a busy schedule of events and publications for 2021. We've got work on clean energy and green steel, advanced manufacturing, reports on the effects of privatisation, contracting out of government work, artificial intelligence, geopolitics, and plus we will shortly release the latest and the 13th edition of the Toxin, which is internationally themed edition. We've got some terrific contributors from Australia, from expat Australians such as Sharon Burrow, who heads up the ITUC in Brussels. And we will also very shortly put out a call for submissions to the 4th iteration of our Young Writers Prize, which will also take the form as a special edition of Toxin, the 10 leading editions. And again, we're very proud to partner with Victorian Trades in encouraging young writers to put pen to paper or fingers to laptops. Couple of quick.
What counts as young?
Not me. 26 and under. On Thursday, the 8th of July, we're delighted to be able to stage our annual gala dinner again. We have Labour's Shadow Treasurer, Dr. Jim Chalmers, coming down from Queensland as our special guest speaker. Tickets will go on sale in the next week or shortly afterwards, and they will sell quickly, so please do get in quickly. And later in this year, we will be able to host Craig Foster, who will deliver the 5th John Curtin lecture. We also have a couple of online in-conversation events planned for the next couple of months. The first is with Toby Davison, a scholar at Macquarie University in Sydney, and also the great-grandson of John Curtin. He has just put out a new book on John Curtin, and John Curtin, in particular John Curtin's love of literature and poetry. So I'm looking forward to having a conversation with Toby in mid-May. Again, watch our Facebook page and other forum for news on that event. And in June, we're delighted to host a really brilliant British Labor MP, John Curtin, who's also on an advisory board. Myself and Bill Shorten will discuss John's new book, The Dignity of Labour. Again, that's an in-conversation Zoom event. And here comes the selling pitch. To do all these events, to do this important social democratic research and finding the battle of ideas, we do need your help as supporters, and I would strongly encourage you to sign up as a supporter tonight. Becoming a JCRC supporter provides exclusive access to our policy reports, discussion papers, and our flagship magazine, The Toxin. I know many of you in this room have already signed up. To those of you who haven't, please consider doing so tonight. On each of your seats, or scattered around the room, you will find our supporter guides and handily enough a pen to fill out your details. If you could please return your forms to Santino, our Executive Officer. In possession of